Breaking news from the Red Sea reveals that something massive has just entered the waterway, fundamentally changing the military calculus in the region in dramatic fashion. Iran's recent strikes are already backfiring, accelerating the regime's own collapse rather than relieving the pressure it faces. A third carrier strike group is arriving within 72 hours to join the two carrier groups already positioned in the region, creating an American naval presence of unprecedented scale that represents not just military force, but an unmistakable signal about American commitment and staying power. Simultaneously, the economic blockade that the United States has maintained with remarkable discipline is producing effects that senior Treasury officials are describing in terms that should alarm anyone watching from Tehran. Iranian oil wells are days away from reaching storage capacity, and when that happens, the damage to Iranian oil infrastructure may be geological and potentially permanent. Iran's strikes backfired, and the window for the regime to avoid catastrophic and irreversible consequences is narrowing by the hour. The economic strangulation that American strategy has been applying since the blockade was established is reaching levels that are no longer just painful, but existential. The numbers being discussed by American officials are staggering. Iran is losing between $400 million and $500 million per day in oil revenue that cannot be exported through the blockaded strait. For a government that depends on oil sales for the overwhelming majority of its revenue, this daily loss is not something that can be absorbed through budget adjustments or domestic economic policy. It represents the systematic destruction of the financial foundation that sustains every Iranian government function, every military salary, every subsidy that keeps food and fuel prices at levels ordinary Iranians can afford. The geological dimension that senior Treasury officials highlighted represents a new and potentially decisive element in the calculation that Iranian leadership must make. Oil wells are not simple on and off infrastructure. They operate under geological pressure that must be managed carefully to maintain production capacity and reservoir integrity. When oil cannot be exported and storage capacity reaches its limit, production must be physically shut down. Shutting down oil wells that were operating under pressure is a complex process, and if done improperly or if wells remain shut down for extended periods, it can cause permanent damage to reservoir pressure that reduces the well's future production capacity even after it is reopened. Iran's oil infrastructure has already been degraded by decades of sanctions that prevented access to Western technology for maintenance and modernization. The technical expertise required to manage the geological risks of extended well shutdowns is not fully present within Iran's oil industry, given the loss of international partnerships and personnel over sanction years. If wells are damaged geologically through improper shutdown procedures or extended closure, the Iranian oil industry's recovery capacity after any resolution of the current crisis will be severely diminished. The United States is essentially applying economic pressure that has a built-in accelerating clock, where waiting too long to reach a settlement produces damage that extends the economic crisis well beyond the resolution of the political conflict. The American military consolidation that is occurring with the arrival of the Third Carrier Strike Group creates a force posture that represents both deterrence and preparation. 3 carrier strike groups operating in coordination represent air power and strike capacity that can conduct sustained operations against virtually any target set throughout Iran and the surrounding region simultaneously. The operational planning that would be required to employ this force effectively has almost certainly been ongoing for weeks, with intelligence gathered during the ceasefire period being incorporated into targeting packages that would be ready for execution if negotiations fail, and if the decision is made to proceed to broader military operations. The presence of this massive force also serves a coercive diplomatic function. Iranian leadership, looking at American naval assets positioned in their region, cannot be under any illusions about what continued intransigence risks triggering. The force assembled is not a defensive posture. It is a force capable of conducting comprehensive offensive operations that would make everything Iran has experienced so far look limited by comparison. This visibility of consequences is an intentional element of American strategy designed to make the costs of continued resistance unmistakably clear to whoever within the Iranian leadership structure is still capable of making rational calculations. Iran's provocations, including the seizures of commercial vessels and the firing on civilian shipping, are being analyzed not as coherent strategic decisions, but as panicked, uncoordinated reflexes from an institution, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that has lost the ability to make rational strategic calculations under the pressure of institutional existential threat. The evidence for this assessment includes the fact that these provocations were taken without apparent coordination with other Iranian government factions, that they produced immediate negative consequences that any competent strategic analysis should have anticipated, and that they occurred at a moment when the supreme leader is reportedly in intensive care and unable to exercise the coordinating authority that his position is supposed to provide. The absence of unified Iranian decision-making is perhaps the most dangerous element of the current situation. A regime that can make coherent decisions, even bad ones, is more predictable and ultimately more manageable than a regime that is making contradictory decisions simultaneously from different power centers with different institutional interests and different threat perceptions. When foreign ministry officials are making statements about diplomatic progress, while Revolutionary Guard commanders are seizing ships, when presidential advisors are warning about economic collapse while hardliners are demanding escalation, the international community cannot identify a coherent Iranian position to negotiate with or respond to. The resulting uncertainty creates conditions where miscalculation and unintended escalation become genuinely likely. Iran theoretically possesses what analysts call trump cards, options for escalation that could impose significant costs on international parties and potentially force reconsideration of the current approach. Iran could direct Houthi forces to intensify attacks on shipping at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, potentially closing a second critical global maritime choke point simultaneously with the Strait of Hormuz crisis. Iran could threaten or attack the Yanbu pipeline terminus in Saudi Arabia, through which Saudi oil has been flowing to bypass the strait. Iran could target the underwater internet cables that carry vast amounts of global communications traffic through the region, causing disruption that would affect countries and populations far removed from the current conflict. However, each of these trump cards is simultaneously a self-defeating trap. Executing any of these threats would not relieve pressure on Iran. It would unify the international community against Iran in ways that the current situation has not fully achieved. Countries that are currently sympathetic to Iranian grievances or that are maintaining neutrality would be converted into active adversaries by actions that disrupted their communications, their energy supplies, or their commercial shipping. China, which has maintained some distance from the American position, while quietly managing its own energy security, would find its interests directly threatened by disruption to Bab el-Mandeb or to internet cables. Russia, which has been managing its energy exports opportunistically, would face direct challenges from an Iran that was disrupting global energy markets without apparent rational purpose. The trump cards exist, but playing them accelerates Iranian isolation rather than creating the coalition of sympathy or the international pressure for American restraint that Iranian leadership might hope for. Every Iranian attempt to retaliate or escalate is confirming to watching nations that the regime has lost the ability to calculate its own interests clearly, and that conclusion is the opposite of helpful for Iranian diplomatic positioning. 3 scenarios define the possible paths through the next 72 hours and determine whether the crisis moves toward resolution or toward catastrophic escalation. The first scenario is negotiation, where Iranian leadership somehow overcomes its internal divisions sufficiently to present a unified proposal on its nuclear program that provides the basis for beginning to lift the blockade. This path exists and is being actively pursued by the civilian factions within the Iranian government, but it requires Revolutionary Guard acquiescence that the organization's institutional self-interest makes extremely difficult to obtain voluntarily. The second scenario is escalation, where continued Iranian provocations or desperate actions trigger expanded military operations involving deeper and more comprehensive strikes on Iranian territory. This scenario would represent a decision by American leadership that the negotiated path has been exhausted and that military operations are necessary to achieve objectives that economic pressure alone cannot produce. The intelligence preparation that has been occurring during the ceasefire means that such operations would be conducted with better targeting information and better operational planning than was available in the original campaign. The third scenario is continued status quo, where the blockade maintains its economic strangulation, while Iranian internal collapse proceeds under its own weight. In this scenario, the geological clock on Iranian oil wells becomes decisive, as storage capacity limits force well shutdowns that cause permanent infrastructure damage, further reducing Iran's post-crisis recovery capacity and creating pressure that eventually forces one of the other two scenarios. This scenario favors the American position because patient waiting costs relatively little for the United States, while costing Iran $500 million per day in irreplaceable economic resources. The central thesis of the American strategy is being validated with each passing day and with each Iranian miscalculation. Patient economic strangulation works when it is applied comprehensively, when the international coalition supporting it holds together, and when the target country's internal divisions prevent the coherent response that might create diplomatic opportunities. Something massive entered the Red Sea, and Iran's strikes backfired because they confirmed to the world that the regime making those strikes is not a rational actor capable of coherent strategy, but a collection of competing institutions making desperate decisions that accelerate rather than reverse their own decline.